Hello and welcome back, everyone. In today's lecture, we're going to be tackling a conversation about composition. This conversation is going to take part in three parts. We're going to be tackling the first part today, talking primarily about balance, image construction, and guidelines for understanding pictorial organization. This is going to be a pretty comprehensive talk. We're going to go through some examples and give you the rundown on some basic key terminologies, as well as starting to understand how we can balance and organize a composition. So first off, when dealing with anything in a two-dimensional sphere or realm, we're going to always have this thing that we have to consider. That thing is called the frame. So i.e. this beautiful little black rectangle that we have going on our white screen here. That is something that we're always going to have to consider. Now, whether that is a rectangle, square, circle, triangle, whatever that shape may be, there's always going to be an edge or a boundary, meaning that is the pictorial space, our pictorial frame, or the edge of the paper. All of those things kind of line up to define what the frame is. So that means every single component that goes into this frame has to be considered in its relationship to the edge or boundary of your page. So when we're organizing information, we have a couple of key kind of things we need to focus on. How we can start to not only organize the information in the center of the page, but also how it's going to relate as it gets close to the edge or goes off of the frame. So, as artists, we don't necessarily use words to make our stories or tell our stories or convey our content or meaning to our viewers. What we have instead is the elements of art and principles of design. So what we're going to do is start organizing those elements of art using principles of design to organize compelling compositions, to tell our stories, to share our narratives, and to create and build a meaning or context or common concept for our viewers to digest, view, and take in. Okay, so let's go into what is the simplest way to build a strong composition. So primarily humans have a couple of things that they look for right off the bat. One of those things are form and value. So the relationship between form and value is absolutely critical for understanding how to build a foundation for a good composition. Value and form are the two most important components when constructing a composition, and you must always start to build from those 2 points. So always think value and form. Look for those things. That's the first things your mind and eye start to gravitate towards in a composition. So that's the first place that you should start building a good composition from. I like to understand this and start building off of the principle called NOTAN. NOTAN is a theory developed by Japanese. Primarily this word was kind of invented essentially to describe light and dark characteristics, primarily in terms of how it is a featured kind of critical point of elements of design. So NOTAN, that word is really derived, the Japanese kind of made that word, and it's derived from the Chinese Taoist philosophy of the yin and yang symbol. So really when they were starting to think about how to organize a composition, how to start building elements to describe good pictorial situations or good pictorial compositions, they created this word to really hone in on the meaning of light and dark. And that is one of their base kind of concepts in designing space. And I like to think about this too, and that's why I always like to start off with talking about NOTAN, because it breaks down very complex images into very two simple elements, and that's light and dark shapes. So when we go into talking about light and dark shapes, and I think this is where the Japanese got very inspired by the Chinese Taoist philosophy of this symbol of the yin and yang, it's not necessarily two different spaces, but yet they're two different spaces that have to work together. And I think that's the most critical thing that you can understand when working with both black and white values to build space in your compositions, that they're not diametrically opposed, but rather they need one another to build or to make the holistic whole, right? So this is going to be something that we kind of re-go over and re-evaluate throughout this year. When we start analyzing compositions, not only look at your positive spaces, but also look at your negative spaces to help define one another. One cannot exist without the other. And I think that's the big theory when we get to NOTAN and the power of that concept of NOTAN. Okay, so here's a simple kind of value creates form demonstration. So we've got a beautiful kind of picture of Vermeer over here on the left side. And over on the right side, we have this kind of very crude kind of thumbnail drawing, just using simple kind of markers, just a black marker on a white piece of paper with this kind of thumbnail box that it's been mapped in. We can very quickly see how the white and dark value is working together, but also how the composition is being very well built just based off that black and white value interaction. This looks very similar to our yin and yang with that division. Notice that this composition is primarily balanced heavily on the left side. This is primarily due to the lighting angle that Vermeer chose to depict this scene. We can see that kind of milkmaid pouring in milk and kind of starting the maybe family brunch or breakfast meal. So we can kind of see how this composition is very easily built with just those two values. So when starting off with a composition or when looking at a composition, your eye is going to gravitate towards those dark values and how it's creating form first. That is an always, no matter what. Let's move on to another example. Developing that dark and light sensibility. So once again, we've got another example image over here, and to the right of it, we have a black and white image. So we're really easily able to see how the composition's working here. But when we reduce that information down to just dark values, light values, and our forms, we can really see how the composition is moving us through this page. Now notice we've got this very, very white value. This is originally, it looks like a newsprint or a news piece of paper, and then a chair. I want you to look at the line and how it's directing us forward. We're getting catapulted up into the figure on the right, and then all of the white values, and once again, these lines, this form is creating another area for us to investigate. So this composition is actually very well balanced because of the directional line and the way the form is being built up with value. Notice how we kind of are catapulted back and around in this composition. Our eye is not let out of the composition at all, but rather we're very much centralized in the actual composition itself. So let's look at another kind of artist who utilizes this concept of NOTAN, or black and white, or positive and negative space. And that is Elena Damiati. So we've got a kind of really interesting kind of composition here where she's not only utilizing the frame on this kind of silk print of mountains that she made and then printed off on this kind of silk frame. But then we've also got this black space behind the actual image. So this is actually a two-part kind of installation. We have the image that is printed on a kind of silk frame, and then we have that kind of black space behind it. Notice how the positive and negative spaces are starting to interact with that mountain space. So this is a very interesting kind of figure-ground relationship that's developing from our light and dark values. Notice how our lights are being picked up and promoted because of that white space behind it, and our black values of that mountain are really being pushed forward and saturated because of the black kind of painting behind it. This is another example of hers. We can see the frame really interacting with the colored shapes behind it, and this time she has some installation poles and tree stumps that are painted white behind these kind of silk screened images. We can see this kind of landscape shot and how it's being able to be picked up and differentiated, and we can see that cloud space really being activated by that blue painted wall behind it. So this is another way to start engaging with that idea of NOTAN, how we construct value and form through those kind of simple steps. So let's talk about another kind of critical step in developing a good composition, and that's the idea or the organizing principle of figure-ground relationships. Now, Elena Damiati also really plays around not only with that kind of concept of NOTAN, but also figure-ground relationships. In fact, she really challenges that role quite a bit with the way she is using her subject matter of that landscape and then the background space or the negative space as an activation tool to see our positive space. So once again, that kind of brings into that concept of really unifying our positive and negative spaces like NOTAN really supports. So figure ground, let's dive into what this is. Figure ground is an organizing principle. It's a part of a larger philosophy of Gestalt organizing principles. We're going to talk about this and a later compositional talk. So look forward to that, and we'll be reviewing this once again in that talk. But it's absolutely vital for our understanding of basic pictorial organization is to understand what figure is and to understand what ground is. This is actually kind of, like I said, a psychological definition, and it helps our brains actually identify the figure from its background surroundings. So normally the figure is kind of identified as our main focal point of the composition. This is also termed positive space. So you're going to hear me using these terms in our class quite a bit. So when I refer to positive space, know that I'm talking about the main focal point or the subject matter of the composition. This could be still life items, this could be a human figure, whatever's that main kind of focus of our composition, that's going to be the figure. Now ground. Ground is that kind of area of negative space that operates around our main focal point. And what I mean by that, that could be the atmosphere, the background in which an object or a human is sitting in or surrounded by. And I always like to call this and define this our atmospheric space. So when we're talking about that negative space, that's how we can really start to define what that means. So here's a visual example of just defining that a little bit further. So our positive space is essentially the scissors right here, right? That's outlined in black for you just to make it kind of clear. And then our negative space is that space that surrounds the scissor head, right? So it's all of that air or atmosphere that sits around the scissors themselves. That's highlighted in black for you to be kind of a very, very visually obvious. All right, this principle of figure ground is one of the most basic laws of perception, and it really helps for us to distinguish our figure ground relationship from images and is a critical function of design elements. So whether you're going into design fields, art fields, or you're just going into art as more of a kind of hobbyist, these kind of principles and sensibilities will really lead to a better, well-developed not only understanding of art, but a better composition in the long run. So when we start to use that principle of figure-ground relationship and start thinking about that concept of NOTAN, or positive and negative space as it's called here in the West, once we start to combine those together, we start to get a holistic image, a better view and a better understanding about how these principles can start working together rather than thinking about them as negative components or components that maybe have lesser value. And I think this is one of the concepts why I like talking about NOTAN so much. It talks about positive and negative space relationships having equal ground with each other. I think a lot of times when people talk about positive space or the figures or their main subject or focal matter in the composition, they put more weight and emphasis on that kind of focus point, and they negate the negative space in the image. But when you start thinking about them as equal ground or having equal ground with relationship, you're able to see the whole composition, consider that frame, and make a much more successful composition, and leading to a much more better resolve and kind of understanding of that positive space in turn, okay? So figure ground ambiguity. So let's talk about this. So figure ground ambiguity can be kind of termed in a couple of different ways. It's essentially an illusion kind of trick in some ways, talking about alternating viewpoints. So essentially what that means, and we're just going to kind of go into this image. This is probably one of the most classical kind of images that you can have when talking about figure ground ambiguity. So that means that this is essentially where our brain sees two images at once because it doesn't understand maybe the difference between what the figure is and what the negative space is. So initially when some people look at this image, they see maybe a vase, or they see two human forms coming close together. So once you start to understand that there's two images in one, then your brain can kind of shift back and forth. So this figure ground ambiguity can be not only very interesting as a perceptual tool, but it can also talk about alternating images creating a totally different perception of a space. And once you start playing with this kind of illusionistic territory, you can have some very interesting conversations develop. This is also another interesting way to maybe talk about the pairing of objects, similar shapes, and how to construct an interesting kind of composition from a different kind of perspective. So here's another kind of example. MC Escher, most people have kind of recognized a lot of his illustrations over the years due to their figure ground ambiguity. So we have a lot of illusionistic work that he does, and this is primarily because he utilizes figure ground ambiguity in his work. We can see these white and black swans kind of alternating in this kind of infinity or figure eight position, and we're going back and forth, not really necessarily having any kind of main dominance of the subject, but rather those black and white spaces are working together holistically. So this is another way to think about a NOTAN concept of thinking about positive and negative space working together in a holistic kind of manner to create an interesting composition and a well-balanced composition. Also, we see figure ground ambiguity popping up in all types of different advertising campaigns. So we have these kind of Marvel Universe and, oh gosh, what's the other comic book series? Yes, other comic book series. There we go. DC, there we go. Okay, so we have other we see this a lot coming up in kind of new age kind of revamps of DC comics and Marvel comics. So there was a poster campaign coming out for Batman that came up a couple years ago, and I thought this was pretty important to show some of that significance of the figure ground reversal. This can be a very kind of powerful message too when you start playing with that figure ground ambiguity, because once again, you're not giving particular credence to any one positive or negative space, but rather they're working together. And conceptually as a message, this can be a very, very interesting kind of poster, because we see not only Batman, which is considered our hero, but then we have the Penguin on the far left side, who's considered the villain. Notice how they're working together. Their silhouettes are defining one another. So that kind of ground can be very interesting. Same thing's happening over in this image, right? I think this one becomes a little bit more interesting, though, in its figure ground relationship. So that's just another example of figure ground ambiguity and its working, and also the concept that you can start to derive from it. So let's talk about balance strategies. Balance is by far one of the most important things when it comes to composition. We'll be re-hitting this subject throughout the year and throughout the semester as we move forward. But balance is a strategy in which we should always consider when talking about organizing elements of art in a frame. So we're going to be primarily talking about three of these strategies, and that's symmetrical balance, radial balance, and asymmetrical balance. We're going to primarily talk with symmetrical and asymmetrical first, and we're just going to kind of briefly review radial kind of balance strategies. So let's talk about symmetrical balance. I have some nice kind of definitions. Obviously, feel free to stop the video at any point so you can read over these or view the PowerPoint itself. So symmetrical balance is essentially having a kind of central axis point that divides the frame and a mirror image of your items or figures or subjects in that frame that are being perfectly mirrored. Now, you could have identical symmetrical balance, where that's essentially perfect relationships or perfect ratios of objects, such as here. This is a perfectly symmetrical balanced image. And then you can kind of have some off symmetrical balance too, where it's at least visually kind of matched up, and there is some really nice balancing happening between them, but they might not be exactly the same. But essentially, this is kind of symmetrical balance. It's that consideration of that perfect symmetry being equal on both sides. I often like to equate this to sticking a popsicle stick in the middle of our images and seeing how it's weighted. That kind of talk is going to be used quite a bit in asymmetrical balance when we start talking about it. So let's look at some examples of this. Maya Hayek, this is one of her smaller painting series. Maya Hayek is a contemporary artist. She lives and works in Miami. We can see a lot of her work on the Wynwood murals, as well as in many kind of South Beach galleries. So she's pretty popular, and she's known for her investigation of not only using symmetrical balance, but also her deep investigation in wavelength and wavelengths for defining both sound and auditory and visual wavelengths. So she's really interested in color theory as well as auditory sound waves. So we can see that kind of being depicted here, at least how she's using her symmetrical balance. So we can see this kind of perfect X that's being mapped out on all sides of the image. Once again, she's actually dividing the frame for us with two separate canvases, and we can see this perfect kind of symmetrical balance being equaled and mirrored on both sides. Here is one of her murals and Woodwood murals. Once again, we can see this perfect symmetrical balance playing out where there's repeating forms that are pretty symmetrical on both sides. They repeat in color, form, and value as they kind of go back in space. These little checks go back in space, and some of these lines build up in space. So she's a really great example for a contemporary focus on what symmetrical balance looks like. And remember, she's talking about it from the perspective that she is very interested in what wavelengths of light and sound look like. So we can really start to get that kind of pulsating vibe, not only in terms of her color theory and color use and how she's building up color and saturation with value and saturated colors and desaturated colors, but we're also kind of seeing that kind of buildup of maybe what a sound wave might look or feel like if it was visually depicted. MC Escher, once again, he's going to be somebody that uses symmetrical balance quite a bit in his work. This isn't perfectly symmetric because we do have some swans versus some fishes down here, but this is a pretty symmetrical image. We can see, once again, there's more figure ground ambiguity used, as well as that concept of NOTAN, where he's really considering how his positive and negative spaces are working together to create holistic spaces, spaces that are thinking and considering both not only the figure, but the ground behind it. Kurt Foe is another type of contemporary artist. He's really interested in depicting gemstones on these large format paintings. So he'll cut these kind of sheets of wood and make panels and then depict these kind of perfect symmetrically cut stones. They're quite beautiful, they're very large, and they have some really interesting and fascinating marks. He talks about symmetry and uses symmetry in terms of these kind of perfect cut ratios. So we have this kind of manufactured symmetry that he's not only talking about in terms of beauty and what we find beautiful in these kind of gemstones, but he's also thinking about symmetry in terms of how he's depicting it, how he's actually using symmetry and breaking those rules of symmetry somewhat to talk about symmetrical concepts. So this is actually kind of an interesting concept in terms of how he's using symmetry and then how he's breaking those rules to talk about symmetry. We also see symmetry being heavily used in a lot of religious images and iconography. So this is Leonardo's Last Supper. We can see how this is a very symmetrical image. Once again, we also have some of this importance of symmetry coming into, if we follow these lines back in space to that vanishing point, Jesus and Jesus's head and the top of his head that's kind of mirrored in the sky in the background or the heavens is suggesting not only that he's the most important figure in this composition, but he is the pinnacle of everything that could happen. So we have this relationship where the figure is also being mapped out by the ground behind him, suggesting concepts and alluding to the fact that Jesus is not only the most important figure, but he's a heavenly figure, right? Because he is not only being framed by the door, but the heaven behind him. All of these images or all of these lines, once again, go back to him. So that symmetry is being used here on one point perspective to give us that kind of energy, give us that directional line, and suggest the kind of importance that the figure of Jesus in this particular work has to the viewer. We can also see a variety of other lines being used to kind of direct us here throughout the kind of work itself. So this is just another example where not only symmetrical balance, but concepts of symmetrical balance can play an important role in developing an idea or a message to the viewer. This is another kind of religious example. This was Christ giving the keys to the kingdom to St. Peter. So this is another very important work. This is during the kind of Renaissance era, and we can see kind of linear perspective being really used. Linear perspective was developed in around 1450. 15. But we can see how linear perspective, once again, is playing an important role. Those lines and that figure, ground, and symmetry are really important roles about how to define religious information in talking about balance, talking about composition, and relaying what is the most important kind of information. Notice we have not only Jesus being framed here and St. Peter being framed here by this negative space, but also the city and the ground itself, which it's being mounted, is also the most important thing here. So this is actually a very kind of interesting change in roles. It is a religious image. It does have a lot of concept behind it in terms of its power and significance of the figure of Jesus. But we also see, too, the ground in which the negative space is being saturated. That place of St. Peter's is also taking an important role due to the way it's being balanced by these two groups of people. So this is another kind of example of symmetrical balance. So let's talk about radial balance. I'm only going to show you one example here because radial balance is pretty easy to get right off the bat. We don't see maybe this one as much. We do see it a lot in mandala kind of structures. So this is a mandala, essentially your, or a type of mandala, but essentially your center point is your access point in which everything is built off of. So essentially you'll start with a kind of center point, and then all of your structures will essentially radially work out in a symmetrical way from that strongest sense in the beginning all the way out to the edges. So this is a really good, clean example of what radial balance looks like. Hence why it's here. You can also read my notes on the side. So we see a lot of radial balance primarily used similar to symmetrical compositions or balances. We see a lot of radial compositions being used in religious images and iconography as well. That's primarily due to how it is built up. Similar to symmetrical balance, there's a very kind of strict unity that happens, as well as it allows for a placement of a central important role. So as we can see here, the Buddha is in the center, and then we have the corresponding deities and Buddhas, as well as shamans and kind of important figures or religious figures that are falling outside of the Buddha. So this is a really kind of important organizing kind of method for religious iconography, just because it plays once again on that central focus on that kind of central access point, and then it builds out. So we can also think about grid work as a type of radial balance. It depends on the type of grid, of course, but that can be a type of balancing strategy in some ways. Okay, so let's talk about asymmetrical balance. By far, I think we see a lot more asymmetrical balanced images today than we do maybe any of the other two, radial and symmetrical balance that we've talked about. Asymmetrical balance really talks about having optical weight. So we're going to dive into what optical weighting is, and we're going to give you some good examples in this particular section. So essentially, we're going to have this black line. This is going to serve kind of like our imaginary popsicle stick. If we could divide the page, what would our optical weighting look like? So notice we have this kind of red ellipse down in the bottom left, and these two black squares two blue squares that are connected on the top right. So they do feel balanced, and that's primarily due to a couple of factors, and we're going to talk about these factors as they work out in the examples. But there's three things mainly here. So there's the shape relationship. So they're both diametrically opposed. This is a square shape. This is kind of a circular or round shape. The color is different. The value is also similar, but they're also spacing is similar. So we'll break that down a little bit more. So they're diametrically opposed, meaning that there's going to add some kind of definite tension between them, but it's balanced out because they are so different, but they have similar value structures. Red value is very saturated to our eyes, so often sometimes it's hard to identify the value of red, and it takes a couple of tries to really understand the value operation, especially of red. We'll get to why we see red so saturated when we get into our color theory section. But this is actually a pretty equal value to this blue, or it's close to it. So this is actually kind of well balanced out. We also have this object that's sitting lower to the ground, and that kind of creates a natural kind of balancing strategy because when we think about how we normally orient our eyes, we think about ground as a heavy space and the sky space being a heavenly space and usually lighter values up top. So there's a couple of reasons that this is actually balanced out. We can also look at that kind of negative space in between the edge of our red ellipse here and that kind of black line. Same here. It is much closer than it is here. That kind of tension can sometimes add extra weight as well. So when we talk about optical weighting, we're really talking about how the elements of art are relating to that side of the frame. So this is an installation from a contemporary artist, Franklin Evans. Franklin Evans is really known for a lot of his kind of interesting and very explosive take over the room kind of installations. This is at PS1 in MoMA. I think this is around, I don't want to guess the date because I'll probably be wrong, but this is in New York City, New York. And so this is a really lovely and very interesting kind of compelling installation. We notice here he's using a lot of bright saturated colors with tape. He's taping bits of notebooks down, sketchbooks, and things like that. We also have a lot of fragmented drawings and images that are actually appearing in this installation as well. This is an actual balanced installation shot. So we're going to talk about why this is balanced. This is a pretty hard one to kind of start with, so I think it's a good one for us. It's actually divided down the center with this bright pink roll of tape. We can also see that we have a big square in the center. It's actually off center, so there's a little bit more optical weighting on our left side, but that's balanced out by the left-hand side and the big white chunk of kind of what we're seeing as negative space. As we can see, the negative space over here is much more activated by positive space moments. But once again, that is balanced out by how large this section of the square is, and then also our severe cropping of this left-hand side tape triangle or arrow kind of direction thing. We can see how that's balanced out by this as well, so it doesn't become too heavy. And then also to that gray rafter or gray light post that's hanging down also balances out the image. So installation shots are always a little tricky because of course we never see the full installation and we don't get the real feel for it. But I think this photographer actually captured a lot of Franklin Evans' organizing themes. He is really known for kind of organizing chaos, so when we do look at his work, there's a lot to absorb, but he's very good at balancing that kind of chaos, like I said. All right, Wrath of the Medusa. One of my favorite images, absolutely a brilliant composition. This took many years to create. It is giant and it is absolutely wonderful. You can see this located in the Louvre. This is a masterclass in composition and understanding composition. I want us to kind of glare our eyes or defocus our eyes for a minute, and I want you to notice the light pockets that are happening in this composition. And when I say light pockets, I just mean those figures and objects that have a lot of light value. And then I want you to notice those kind of darker values that are popping up naturally within this composition. He is playing here with constructing triangles as our main compositional device. This is completely balanced. We have so many elements. We have a lot of dark spaces and a lot of light spaces that are being well balanced by the way he's placing them in the image and the relationship to the frame. So we have triangle forms that are happening here that are taking us up into this space with those white kind of forms. We also have that line going through the hand and extending through eyesight, as well as our figures down here. So that is one full white triangle that's being mapped out or lined out for us optically. And then we have a large dark triangle happening here. This is actually being able to be followed by through that sail mast that's kind of coming down right here, and the kind of rope that's holding it down on the other side, and then brought back down through here with our darker figures and our figures in shadow. So we can really see how he's balancing this very tricky and very complicated form with triangles and playing with positive and negative space placement. So he's really kind of thinking about how everything is being cropped. I also want to turn our attention to the bottom portion of the image. I want you to notice how our images are being cropped over here. It's pretty even in terms of its cropping, and the way it's a little bit higher up here, but the way he balances that out is with this darker space, he adds a lighter space down here. So whenever balancing, we have to think about this kind of act of optical sensibilities, whether it's dark and light and matching that sensibility, whether it's a curved line versus a straight line and matching that sensibility, or whether it's where you crop an image and where it goes out of the frame and kind of matching it and playing around with different sensibilities of color, saturation, value, or shape. Those kind of sensibilities and altering them can really affect the way your composition is balanced. So this is another kind of interesting work in terms of balancing acts that happen. And this is actually, Matthias Welcher's work really plays with physical weight. So as we can see, I like to get this side angle shot so you can actually see how thick the paint is built up. This is almost about a ½ an inch to maybe 3/4 of an inch thick. So this thing took a long time to dry. But what's really interesting here is that he's reversing that kind of role of optical weighting in some ways. As I mentioned, a kind of normal situation for most human viewers is that when we look at a space or look at a frame, our orientation is that the darker elements that we're used to are grounded on the bottom with the ground. The horizon line sits somewhere dividing that space, and wherever it may fall, we have it up top with the sky space. Sky spaces are usually associated with lighter values, think clouds, right? So that's kind of our normal viewing orientation. Of course, you can change that and speak to those kind of characteristics if you change it to kind of play along with your composition or your concept with that composition. Here he reverses that role with giving us this very heavy, dark kind of red building walls and giving us this kind of hallway aspect. It then gives us this very light value that's operating on the bottom portion of our composition on the canvas. He's also playing with physical weight as being kind of tongue-in-cheek almost here with talking about optical weighting. This thing is super thick and dense. There's a physical weight not only with the value that he's playing with, right? These are two different values, darker, lighter, but he's also playing around with physical weight in terms of how much paint is being applied to the canvas. This thing sits heavy, it feels heavy, and there's actual heavy weight associated with it. So this could be another way to think about how we optically weight something and how we treat that kind of object in the space. Julie Moretu, one of my absolute favorite artists. I will probably refer to her once again, probably in this class. I love her. So she is just a brilliant artist in my mind. She is also one of those artists who really organize chaos well. As we can see, there's multi-steps to this drawing. There's schematics in the background of stairs and buildings. Then there's these kind of chaotic lines, as well as really vibrant, very textural marks operating on top, along with these kind of color-shaped backgrounds. So we can see how she's maybe organizing space here. We've got a lot of dark kind of values and textures that really draw the eye in this region. Then she balances it out with these kind of very clean, curvilinear white lines. This balances this space off because, once again, that not only the value contrast, but the contrast in line quality. We also see a nice balance out of this red space here. It's very saturated, darker in value. Notice how this space is much larger, but it feels optically balanced with the space on the bottom left. The reason that is because of the cropping that happens. Whenever you crop anything on a corner or the edge of the frame, it adds tension and it adds a lot more weight. Our brain kind of zooms in on that space and it makes it feel heavier because that, of course, is where something ends or something can't be seen going off on the composition. So it adds just more mental kind of interest and thus kind of weights the image. Now notice, once again, like I said, this space is much larger, but it's not cropped. So there's a balancing act that happens here. We can see her also playing with this lighter value of the yellow. Notice how that it doesn't really appear over here, but once again, we have some really interesting and kind of sharp crops and a lot of lighter blue space over here, and there's not as much dark space on this side of the composition. So it's really well balanced in terms of its light and dark values, in terms of line line quality, as well as its cropping of those kind of significant shapes, not only in the foreground but in our background regions. So let's talk about employing color. So another way to optically weight something, which we've been kind of talking about naturally and organically throughout this talk, is through color. So like I said, there's going to be certain colors that our eyes and our brains are just more attracted to. Red has that kind of pull for us as human beings. We also can notice too that complementary colors have a really great relationship and can be used as a type of organizing tool for balancing a composition. So red and green, that's a classical composition for a complementary color scheme. So we have 3 apples on the left-hand side. They're lighter in value, and they should, since they take up more space, be optically heavier. But since it's balanced out by a much darker value and a much more saturated red, plus it's a complement, it is balanced out by the weight of the red apple. So this is a good example of showing about how color and also value can equalize kind of a composition. I explained that here, so yeah, if you want to stop and read that, there you go. Here's another example about color and how it maybe works out in an actual composition of fine art. So we have Christina's World, a very famous painting. I think this is in Chicago's Art Institute. But this is kind of playing also with the complement rule, so that we have a very neutralized kind of green here and a neutralized kind of pink. There are some value distinguishing differences between them that kind of distinguish them on the page or the canvas. Her dress here is very light, so we can kind of see a very big divide between our subject and ground relationship. And we have a kind of neutralized green here that's much darker in value. But I also want us to look at our composition. Once again, we can kind of see a triangular structure appearing, but we're balanced out by how dark this value is with how light her value of dress is. She's also in this field of a complementary color, which is kind of a gray-green. So it's balancing out some of these kind of negative space feelings that we're having, or maybe that would maybe feel like this would maybe feel like a little empty, but it's balanced out because how close the frame is to our house on the top right center, and also how kind of she's looking at this space. So it becomes a very well balanced composition, not only in terms of the color relationship of the pink and the green, but also because of the edge relationship. So this is a very sophisticated painting for a lot of reasons. And so that's a really good example of maybe how we can think about color balancing out a composition. There we go. You can see my notes right there. So this is going to be, I think, one of our last slides that we're going to go through. Another great example of a great balancing act that happens in a composition. So notice that we have a severe crop on the right-hand side. The umbrella's cropped, the man's cropped. This is a just very heavily weighted image. So not only that, we feel this kind of weight over on the right side, but it's kind of actually working in its benefit. This is actually an Impressionist painting. This was featured in the very famous first exhibition of the Impressionists. He was actually, I think, probably one of the only Impressionists to get merit on his work from the critics of that time period. They said that he was the only one that can actually render anything. So, but I think what the really powerful thing about this piece is that he's really demonstrating the kind of atmosphere and that kind of quality of a rainstorm or after a rainstorm in a city space. I think often when we associate Impressionist work, we think about landscapes, we think about this dappling of light, very loose handling of brushstrokes, and a lot of play of color. But there's a tremendous amount of color as well as atmospheric perspective and that kind of haziness. So let's get back to this crop. So let's look about what he's doing with organizing this composition. So first off, we've got a pole dead center in our composition, and we've actually got this dark horizon line that actually divides the composition. So we actually have quadrants in this thing. So it's divided up into 4 separate squares. And although this is a very heavy space, he counterbalances it with a very intense angle of light positive space or negative space here. So it's able to be balanced out because of how he's playing with light and dark values, how he's thinking about positive spaces and negative spaces and those light values that are attributed to both areas. We can see also a very kind of vast negative space that stretches all the way up to the top and all the way to the bottom on the left-hand side of the image, opening that space up. So it kind of has this counterbalancing effect where we see this cluster of massive dark figures walking towards us in the foreground on the right side, but it's balanced out by all of that light negative space on the left-hand side. So that's going to kind of conclude our talk on composition. Stay tuned for future talks on composition. We're going to be adding to this conversation quite a bit. Keep in mind the kind of frame device as well as that pictorial edge of your paper while working on projects, how you crop things, how you use your positive and negative spaces, as well as how you use line quality to differentiate and balance your images, as well as that color. So this is going to conclude our talk. Thanks so much and have a great day.